Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Benzo Boyce, and today's conversants are Dimes and Jean. They're both Canadians, and they have recently put together a documentary, Paving Over the Public, and it's about how the Canadian government has disregarded the will of the Canadian people in order to immigrate or import thousands upon thousands of foreigners. What is the impact of that upon Canadian identity and the Canadian population is what we get into in this episode. Found the documentary to be fabulous. Both these guys are really great, solid guys, and if you want to learn more about their work, you can find links to it down there in the description, as well as links to support this channel. Without further ado, here is Dimes and Jean.
We don't get the cool hat for this one, I guess.
I could get a hat, but I don't see no face, so you have to show me up one. Unless are you a non?
Yes, I hope that's not a huge problem.
No, just a minor disappointment, but only because it helps me to see the faces and stuff. But I can get with it.
Yeah, just thank you. Sorry about that. I know that if everything goes our way, one day we will be doxxed. At one point, my face will be everyone else's problem.
Yeah. Well, if you keep going down this trajectory, the Guardian will probably come after you.
Well, we're in Canada too, so on one hand, the legal infrastructure is pretty hostile towards heterodox ideas, but on the other hand, it's my opinion, and Jean, maybe you can correct me, I don't see much of an Antifa presence, or there's not as many people who are like trying to call you work, although that does happen.
Really?
Like when I was a young man, there were a few people who came after me when I made some of my views public. That was a long time ago, but nothing amounted from it. They just like unfriended me off of Facebook and said I was a jerk, and that was it. So,
so this.
I lost a job when Trump was elected, and I was too happy, but that's about it.
Oh no, isn't funny?
And that sounds pretty safe too. Like that wasn't even like an extreme act, but I was doing marketing at a law firm at the time in Toronto, and it was like I went into the office the day after the election, and women were crying in their cubicles. And I'm like, first of all, you're not even in America, so I don't know what this is.
I don't know. The ladies up there do identify with our politics for one reason or another, it seems like.
That is true, and I suppose that'll be part of the topic of discussion at some point today.
Yeah.
But also, one comment I make to people is if you were living up here during that first presidency and looking at the newspapers, you could be forgiven for thinking you were living in America because it was Trump coverage 24/7 up here.
Mm-hmm.
It was only once Trudeau really started, shooting himself in the face in the media that people kind of switched back, like, oh, this is interesting.
Yeah. Huh. I'd like to get into that a little bit. Trudeau's reign of error.
Yeah, well, actually, and in a relationship to the little documentary that we did, it's kind of the same story. Yeah. That's, ours focuses on this window of time, but it's kind of the same mechanism behind the scenes, and Trudeau's really a product of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, my style is just to dive in. Is there anything else that we should pre-talk about before we talk?
No, I was planning on keeping my language pretty PG-13, not a whole lot of cursing like I've done on, Jay Burden show or anything like that. So if that's okay with you, but if there's anything you didn't want us to say, I guess let us know.
Yeah, the only thing that I don't want to get into is the exact mechanism by which the COVID treatment interacts with human body parts, because YouTube doesn't want us talking about that. So
yeah, we got some videos taken down for that too.
So you know that. Yeah, so that's the only thing that yeah, and don't say cunt or faggot. Those two things.
You got it. It's always funny when I was on the Prudentialist one time, and I was like, I'm going to play this safe, and he was the first one to like drop that stuff. I'm like, oh, okay, so we're having fun now.
Yeah. I like the spice, but I also like monetization. So it's a fine balance between selling out and eating.
Absolutely, we'll do you proud.
So how did you guys get it into your heads to make a documentary about Canadian, immigration, or the Canadian government's practice of immigration over the last, what would you say, 80 years, 60 years?
Well, maybe Jean, you can start with that because I have my story, but I'd be interested because Jean was so integral to the production of the documentary. He came with so many of the facts. I really do think this was of personal interest to you. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I mean, I took a great interest. So basically, the documentary that we did, in large part, was based on an article that was published on Dime's blog, The Vanguardist Journal, in November of 2023. And that was written by a guy named Cooper. And what he had detailed is something that we don't hear often about in Canada. Many of us on the dissident right, or whatever we want to call this thing of ours in Canada, are very familiar with immigration levels and the changing demographics that we've seen in the post-war era that really culminated in the 1980s in terms of policy, but then their full consequences have been seen probably best in the Justin Trudeau era. But what people didn't know about is the policies, and if they knew about the policy changes, they didn't know why the policy changes were put into place. And so I think that that's why I took such a great interest in this project, is because the article dove into pro-immigration sources to reveal how things had actually taken place, and more specifically because of the personal ideologies of bureaucrats and to an extent a couple of our prime ministers.
Well, and your documentary points the finger at international pressure, well, so-called international pressure, the UN specifically.
To kick it off, yes, that was the first impetus for it. But then there's also the personal urges of the bureaucrats and the prime minister, specifically John Diefenbaker, who is a conservative prime minister from 57 to 63. But yes, to kick it off, it was absolutely the United Nations. And then the United Nations, basically, that era went from the tail end of the Mackenzie King government, which was 35 to 48, and then also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 48 influenced the subsequent government, which was Louis Saint Laurent's administration. Mm-hmm. That's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and what he's touched on there is that this was really a bipartisan effort. And for those who don't know Canadian politics, you have the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. Those are the two main parties, very, very similar to America. But it's the same sort of trend across time where you would think the conservatives are, in a sense, reactive to the liberals, but not in ways that you would expect. So there's one amazing case in the documentary where the liberals will propose an immigration reform, and then the conservatives, of course, will push back against the liberals by saying it's not progressive enough. The liberals are the real racists, or they'll make special concessions in an attempt to beat them politically while also forwarding the same agenda. So there actually is no real way to vote against it. And I guess that leads into what got me into this, because Jean had mentioned the Vanguardist Journal article, and this was something that we had published that went through all the same stuff that you'll see in the video. But what inspired me to really go down that road, one, it's that in Canada, at least from my perspective, there was a dearth of content, video content, and even literary content, written content about the mass migration, about this type of stuff we're interested in. A lot of people speak of these issues within the American context or even within the European context. But if you wanted, for example, a history of mass migration in Canada or a history on Quebec nationalism, anything like that, because that's a very interesting topic. There's not a lot of readily available content out there, at least not from our perspective. So I said, well, we can produce something that is serious and that is well made and, in my opinion, mainstream friendly. Like, this isn't a documentary that is full of memes and full of hostile language, which is fine. Yeah. That's my show, Blood Satellite. But, it's something that you could show regular people who probably have never even heard this before. And now, from a personal perspective, and this is also given Americans and other people of context, I'm in my 30s, right? But my entire life, we were told that Canada is a multicultural nation. That is how we define ourselves. And under the reign of Justin Trudeau, he would say, we are a post-nation state. We are a post-nation. Now, that sounds like a bombastic statement, but the seeds of that were sown much, much earlier. So the idea of the Canadian story is a story of multiculturalism. Okay, that was taken for granted. Was that always the case? Well, any normal person can intuit no. Of course, that wasn't always the case. So when did that change? And what's interesting about Canada is the change happened relatively recently. Now, you can trace the roots of many American migration issues back far in time. But I would argue, and maybe Jean, you could tell me if I'm right or wrong with this. I really think there was almost a whiplash for how fast mass migration occurred in Canada. And what we established in the documentary was it was always against the public wishes. It was always against the opinion polls and everything. And so because it happened so fast and because the temperature was raised so slowly, I think that's how you get the current state of affairs in Canada right now, where there's such open hostility towards, in one specific case, which is the Indian migration question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Yeah. So can we, I'm curious about describing the temperament of Canada's elite. It seems like they have kind of an inferiority complex. I'm just shooting from the hip, but from what I see, why they are going so far, so fast in the progressive direction when they don't have to, right? Why do they have to prove themselves as anti-racist? They're you guys are rather a small country comparatively. You do have a lot of untapped wealth materially, and you're a very rather homogenous society when I was up there, and this is 20 years ago. Why would they make such a strong push towards multiculturalism if not to prove themselves as some sort of leader on the world stage or something along that lines? Do you follow? Does that track?
Yeah, I think that, see, from the left and the right, you see this phenomenon happen in the mid 20th century. And so what I mean by that is we covered Diefenbaker quite extensively, and this was a conservative guy who ostensibly was totally like a Canadian nationalist. That's kind of how George Grant described him in 1965 in Lament for a Nation, which Americans probably aren't familiar with that book. Canadians will be. But this is a guy who grew up between the world wars and experienced the hostility of Anglo-Canadians against Ukrainians and Germans. And this is something that tapped into his psyche. And so he became a fervent anti-racist. He embraced the Commonwealth and Anglo-Canadianism at one point. But by the same token, he wanted to erase any kind of racial discrimination in Canada. So this is the conservative hero of that time. And then
well, what made him conservative then?
Well, I guess because he's, well, besides the fact that he was the leader of the Conservative Party, I would say probably because he was a red Tory. So he was the last gasp of a type of Canadian nationalism that was based on a loyalty to Britain and to the Commonwealth, as opposed to a kind of like globalist, like man of every nation, which is what you see.
And you still kind of see that, don't you, John? I think there's still sort of a red Toryism and a sort of red ensignism, or a lot of nationalists I've seen are still clinging to a British identity. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, Canadian nationalists in our context are in the modern day. However, the conservatives have now transferred over to a blue Toryism, which is like a pro-American, pro-capitalist type of conservatism. And you see that transfer basically in the regime of Brian Mulroney. And he was in from, I think, 84 through 93. So that's like kind of like the Reagan, Thatcherite, and Mulroney alliance. Those are kind of like the three leaders of the West that really encapsulate that.
And if I could interrupt just quickly for Ben, your context, if you look at the current leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, you still see that now, where if you look at his campaign, which is kind of in trouble right now, but we can get into that later, pretty much the only thing he's running on is anti-tax. There's no mention really of anything immigration. So it's still that like small government, cut the tax, and kind of vaguely gesture to entrepreneurialism.
Nothing with regard to a cultural solidarity or an evocation of Canada as a specific people.
No, it's just propositionalism. That's all it is. That's his campaign.
Yeah. And also, and this is a bit more Canadian context, Canada is a different case study than America. And there's a lot of sort of inputs to the American story that prohibit discussions that could happen in Canada. But like, for example, the Canadian identity as we know it is, I would argue, even bipartisan. You could say tripartisan. I have a friend named Forta Sachs who talks extensively on this. But when you think of the Canadian identity, it is Anglophone and Francophone. It is British and it's also French. So you cannot really tell the story of Canada without telling the story of Quebec. And it's this sort of binary thing that almost, I don't think it can ever be resolved. It can kind of be reconciled.
Yeah.
But yeah, so when you talk about Canadian nationalism, it has to contain nationalisms, which is a different thing entirely.
But it's interesting because Quebec wants to be kind of ethnically not necessarily superior, but inclusive or exclusive of the not Francophone part of Canada, right? So you would think that they would have a nationalism, that they would want to protect themselves from something like mass immigration from Asia or Africa or, the global South. Is that the case at all? Do they have any will to solidarity or internality?
Quebec has always been anti-immigration. Like at every time where every Anglo-Canadian or any province or territory that wasn't Quebec had to accept a certain number of immigrants, Quebec has typically been able to lobby against that and get a reduction of 20% less immigration per capita than the rest of the country, for example. What you see in the modern day is that is now swayed because they've lost a lot of their Catholic heritage and a lot of their French heritage, but they still do cling to the language thing. And so what you'll see from Quebec is they are reticent to accept migrants. And when they do accept migrants, they typically want to accept migrants from former French colonies, like I guess Morocco or whatever. So that's kind of how that plays out in the modern day. But
they still have to accept migrants because of the power.
That's right. Yes, more than they probably would like. But I mean, everyone has to accept more migrants than they would like, and that's kind of the point of in the documentary when we have these polls popping up, which we populated mostly from Gallup polling in the 40s through 70s. That showed just no one wanted this. First off, no one wanted more migration. Canadians were roundly against that. And then when the demographic changes started to happen, they were specifically against that, probably even more unanimously than they were against just migration numbers.
Yeah. And Quebecois nationalism is a fascinating area of study because on one hand, you have very strong nationalist sentiment. If you go into the sort of Quebecois discourse right now, you'll see a lot of them laughing like, oh, we don't need to worry about the Indian migration problem. That hasn't hit us yet. And, I've been to Quebec many times. I love Quebec. So there's no hostility from me because that's kind of like a fake thing in Canada where everyone hates Quebec. Not really. Yeah. But the problem is that also in Canada, we have this thing called equalization payments. So have and have not provinces. So wealthier provinces give money to other provinces to kind of keep them afloat. And it's this variable thing. And for the longest time, and I believe the numbers are still holding true, Quebec is the number one recipient of equalization payments. So they're in this really precarious position where I think if they could, they would like to leave, but they actually can't. And that's just a strict economic problem right now. So a lot of the bloviating is just that. But, if it came down to it, would they need to do something? If the hammer came down and they were turning off that spigot, maybe. It's hard to say.
Yeah. Who would they turn to if they needed another sugar daddy to make up for what they've gotten used to?
Well, this is kind of a sidebar, but if you just look at the economic and trade element of this, I think this was even pointed out by Peter Zeihan and a lot of others, so I'm not coming up with this, but if you look at the economic relationships of each province, they have a stronger trade relationship to the south. So with America directly rather than horizontally.
Yeah.
So and that's true with Ontario, that's true with Alberta and whatnot. So there is a theory that if Canada were to, when they talk about, annexing Canada, that's not really a serious conversation, but there is a conversation that...
You say that, but...
Well, here's the thing. It's a conversation that's been going on for 50 years. One of the reasons we have NORAD is because America has always been agitating Canada, saying you're not holding up your end of the defensive bargain. And really the topic is Arctic sovereignty. Now, throughout my life, I've always heard the term Arctic sovereignty. And there's a very real geopolitical concern with safeguarding the North against China, Russia, whoever. So when Trump actually talks about that, he talks about an economic war. It's not even really a Trump thing. He's just continuing on a conversation that's been going on again my entire adult life, which is, can Canada secure its own sovereignty? And does that open up a danger zone that will eventually impact America?
Yeah.
Does that sound fair, John? Or am I getting all that, do you think?
Yep. That's totally fair to say.
Just to before we move on from Quebec, could it be the case that this tension between Quebec and the rest of Canada is being leveraged in order to weaken Canada towards massive immigration? If Quebec saw itself as Canadian and kind of like have a more filial relationship, a positive filial relationship with the other provinces, it would agitate more towards a national sovereignty as opposed to an international, I don't know, airport, non-sovereign nation, a post-sovereignty nation. Is that kind of like?
I mean, sorry, just to jump in really quickly, I actually think I'm from the West. I grew up out west, and so we are probably the most hostile to Quebec nationalism. And as a Canadian nationalist now, I'm actually kind of warming up to the fact that Quebecois, as a people, they have their own thing. And I would actually like to see that strengthened, to be honest, because it's an example of what we could do. So rather than like Quebec cozying up to the rest of us, it's almost like they're the last gasp of what we would like to do. So they can have their thing, and then we can build on it and use them as an example. I mean,
Yeah.
even like the inception of Canada as an agreement between Anglophones and Francophones was to resist the hegemony of the United States to the south. So there always was an alliance there. So I don't think
Okay.
that precludes national unity for Quebec to be strong again or stronger than it even is now.
Yeah. That
Yeah,
kind of distantly echoes the right-wing discourse around Israel. If Israel can be more or less an ethno-state rather than a propositional nation, why can't Britain or France or something like that? So,
And that's a good point. And I would argue that European nations probably would have an easier time of doing that because, of course, the French people have historical mandate. They've got a long and rich history. So do many European nations. The age of Canada is a factor. And also, like what Jean just said, that the Canadian structure is more of a commonwealth, so it doesn't even attempt to be one single coherent nation, even from its inception. And it seems to cultivate, they want to have these sort of intranationalisms. And I don't, if we're even talking about something like you might see in Israel, you would be talking about a new ethnogenesis, which you can talk about. Like, how would you forge a single coherent people in this nation? I don't think we're there yet. Arguably, we could never be there, and we just need to kind of work with what we got. And as John had pointed out, like, do you want to subsume the Quebecois identity into a general Canadian identity? A lot of Canadian nationalists would say no, the ones that I know, and that's why they have taken so strongly to what's called the Canadian Red Ensign, the shield aspect of it. Because if you look at the Red Ensign, it's sort of like the British flag, and then there's a little shield in there. And it's more of the shield that people are looked at, because within that shield, you have the balance of these different peoples in one coherent symbol. That seems to electrify people. And I think, we can talk about how to make I kind of go by the Paul Hazard definition of a nation as growing up from the people, kind of grows from the tribe and then into city state, then it's generative. Whereas, the Canadian experiment was more just a sort of almost postmodern structure built around these people. So
yeah.
it would be far off. And maybe arguably we don't need to do that. That's why the Canadian story is so different than the American one. And that's why when you hear about like, oh, Maple MAGA, or here's the Canadian version of an American thing, I'm like, it doesn't even address the fundamentals.
Yeah. Well, there was that trucker protest that was very exciting from an American point of view. It's like, look, the Canadians are standing up for themselves, and they're standing up against the tyranny of their government that went way further, well, depending state to state, but a lot further than most American states. So that
Absolutely.
seemed like, was that like
that.
the bedrock of a new national identity? Was there something there that has carried on from that kind of electrical moment?
I like to hear what you have to say about that, Jean. I will say from my perspective, having paid close attention to that, and I wasn't in the trucker convoy myself, but I went to go see it, and we were involved on the periphery of it. That was a real kind of, again, use the word electrifying, but a generative sort of thing, which it almost shouldn't have happened. To all outside observers, I even heard some people on our side saying it should not have happened because, oh, that's going to signal to the bureaucracy that and it taught them a new trick that we have. But if you actually looked at the demographics that were in that trucker protest, it was, well, I mean, just to say the obvious, it was mostly white guys. And if anything, I saw we have like a lot of Indian truckers up here too, but they did not participate, and B, they didn't like it because they thought it made their job harder. But you saw just sort of like an upswell of some latent Canadian identity, and it didn't have a banner like that. It didn't have a website. It's just like a thing that happened, and a certain type of person showed up. I would argue it was a vaguely right wing personality, but then within that it's working class, within that it's conspiracy people, like anti-vax types, but then there's also libertarians in there too. There's a lot of right-wing adjacent people that just conglomerated in this one direction. I think you might have seen similar like in the farmers protests all throughout Europe and stuff like that. So I don't know, that to me signaled something that I didn't even know was there, or maybe I had even counted out at the time. And that signaled to a lot of people like, oh, there's something here.
And just for sake of clarity, when you say Indian, do you mean from the Indian country as opposed to natives?
Oh, I just meant India.
For language. Yeah, from India. Okay, so because sometimes Indian is conflated with native.
Yeah.
And when you guys talk about natives, you'll talk about natives. Indian means from India.
Typically, Canadians will say Aboriginal, not even Abba. That's like an Australian thing. I just to ignore that whole problem, I say Aboriginal, but I don't know if there's a preferred term. John, maybe
just
you have one.
Very small note, just in case we go back, because India is where a lot of this migration is coming from.
Absolutely. And that's the more, I'd say it's always been there. And there's a funny story. Maybe Jean, you could speak to this. I remember the, what's it called? The Asia Exclusion Act, is one of the first anti-immigration bills. And a lot of people hear that and think, oh, this is about the Chinese, right? Because Canada has a lot of Chinese people. Maybe they're trying to address that. But, in fact, it was anti-Indian immigration. There was a problem of Indian immigration and people just sneaking in, and to the point where we needed legislation to stop it. But back then it was just called Asian, and it kind of still is in Europe. But even back then we had to create a division because we also have so many Asians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was dating from when about, and then go on. I'm sorry to interrupt so much, John.
Oh, that's okay. I mean, that was a problem that I think was mostly in British Columbia at that time. And there's a couple of stories about like shiploads of primarily Sikh immigrants. So like from the Punjab region being turned away. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about it, but that's the origin of that whole thing. Yeah.
Okay. So what is Canada's relationship with immigration, just historically? And then how did it get to ramp up?
Well, I think that's kind of beyond the bounds of the documentary. So to be honest, I haven't filled myself back in on that. I think that a great resource for Canadians or anyone who's interested would be Ricardo Duchesne's Canada in Decay. And he kind of goes over all of that. But there's been a couple of waves of immigration. I mean, primarily immigration was, from the French colonies or from England or Scotland or whatever. There's been a couple of one story, for example, in terms of population expansion is when Quebec really needed to expand. I think this was the early 1800s. I think this is like 1815 to 1851. They had a program called the Fille de Roi, which is like the daughters of the king, I think. I don't speak French. But they had a bunch of maidens that just came over to, make babies with the guys who were already there. So, traditionally, that's how Canada's kind of expanded. When it comes to population expansion to settle the prairies, in like the early 1900s and late 1800s, and that was something where they kind of settled on using more Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans like Italians. And that's probably where you saw the first backlash against European migration because it was so quick, so fast. And you had popular Canadian historians at that time, specifically a guy named Arthur Lauer, who wrote extensively on the problem of Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans. And he said, we don't want mixed race mongrels. He used a lot of pretty hostile languages, I think, when you said Dimes, to describe the intermixing of Anglophones and Francophones with people from Eastern and
Yeah, yeah.
Southern Europe.
They talk about mongrels. It's like talking, don't ever get an Italian boyfriend or something like that. Because one thing we point out in the documentary, which is so fascinating, and this is based on the opinion polls, that when we speak of immigration, we're not just talking about Chinese, African, Indian, but they were saying we don't want more European immigration at times. We don't want more Jewish immigration. We don't want. So it was just. I always I like this part where it's you go back to that time. You put yourself in the mindset of that Canadian, and they're asking you, does Canada need more immigrants? Do you want more immigrants from anywhere? And with a modern sensibility, you would probably have to like untangle that. But back then, it's like, well, why do we need immigration? Like, period. Like, that would be an absurd question to ask them. Why do we need these people? We don't need them. We got a good thing going on over here. They were not propagandized to believe that economic growth exclusively comes from migration of any kind. So to them, it was just like a silly thing to ask. Like, do I want more Bulgarians? No. Why? What? Shut up, weirdo. Like, that was kind of the tone they would take at being asked that question.
So what was the government's role in importing people from different areas? Has it always been, what's driving them, and how would they go about doing that?
Well, in the documentary, in the area that we cover, which is again roughly the post-war era to 1976, it seems to be an ideological thing. I mean, but the mechanism by which they did it was primarily through what's called orders in council, and that is a law or an act that is passed by the cabinet. So that would be like the federal ministers, like the prime minister's roundtable of right-hand guys, through the governor general. So it's not something that's debated in parliament or the Senate. It's just something that you push through. It's kind of a thing that, like, if you just need to do something on the daily and you don't need to make a big thing of it, you can just kind of push it through. Now, ironically, because we talked about the conservative and liberal consensus, ironically, John Diefenbaker, who again would be our prime minister in 57 through 63, in 1949, he criticized then Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent, who was a liberal. And he said to him, you have put through 100+ orders in council relating to immigration in the last couple of years. This is a clandestine measure. You're not doing it with the assent of the Canadian people. You're not letting it be debated. And for us to even look it up, we have to go to the parliamentary record from your office. It's not something you're even announcing in Parliament that you're doing. But then again, in 1962, we saw probably one of the most consequential orders in council passed by John Diefenbaker's administration. So again, the same mechanism that he was criticizing Louis Saint Laurent for using, which in 1962 he repealed almost all of the racial restrictions that we still had in place for immigration. So it's basically, and again, that's the whole point of it. And like a large part of the article that Cooper wrote was based on a book called The Least Possible Fuss and Publicity by Paul Evans. And the whole point of Paul Evans' book was to say this was kind of a thing that was just passed under the table. People didn't want to think about it. They just wanted to put their policies in place without it being debated, and more specifically without the press or the public catching wind of the whole thing. And this is something, again, that was not just in an isolated period of time, but it was the whole period that we discussed in the documentary. They were doing this kind of thing.
Yeah, and the reason they did this is because the public were clear. They were against this sort of thing, so they knew that to get from point A to point B, they had to do this in a clandestine manner.
For why? Number go up, like line go up, GDP is, I mean, that's probably not the reason.
There's a couple of reasons that I can, speak to, and John, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I don't want to speak to the true secret agendas of anyone or any group, but if I had to pick some of the top of my head, one is the sort of post-war consensus and liberal ideology, which just said, like, this is what we're doing now. This is how we treat immigration. It was the software upgrade that a lot of the West got. Same thing in America. Another one, I think, is that sort of brewing Canadian pushback against America, meaning that, America's racist. We're the opposite of race. That's how we stand apart. We're not going to be, we're not going to do the same things that America does, because, like I said before, the story of America, it's almost impossible for any American to approach the migration issue without having to navigate around A, the slavery issue, and B, the whole southern border fiasco. But we don't have that up here. We actually don't have, we're not bordering a nation that was sort of negotiated through conquest and it's spilling over now. We don't have that. And we don't have despite what a lot of progressives say, we don't have that same history of slavery. So our conversation isn't dominated by that. But we can still define ourselves like, oh, we're not racist America. You'll hear Canadians say that. And also, like my entire life growing up, we define ourselves in opposition to America, like, oh, we're also smarter and nicer and more evolved from them. So maybe that's part of it too. We want to win at progressivism. We want to win at liberalism compared to America. And I think that grew over time. And also because once you do this sort of thing for like 10 years, then you have the mandate to say, oh, this is a historical precedent. You know what I mean? If you just kind of white knuckle these legislations, you can just gesture to that later on and say, oh, we've been doing this for a long time, for like a generation almost. And then that kind of shuts down the conversation for some. Then that builds into, I believe, a just complete, and maybe this is part of liberalism too, but a misunderstanding of economics and taxes by them saying, oh, we need a tax base. Our country doesn't exist unless we have more people paying taxes. Otherwise, how can we afford all these things? And then also, we need to make line go up. And then just misunderstanding the relationship between that. Lastly, this is what we get into the documentary more, is internationalist pressures. This is related to the Canadian pushback against America. That's always kind of present, but I do think it was in this post-war consensus, wanting to be part of the international community, wanting to appeal to the UN, and Canada having fewer tools in its toolbox than America, said, well, this is how we can do it. We can become the most progressive on immigration, and now we are in this new world order.
May I just say, and I don't like, I think a lot of the audience members may think that we're filibustering to a degree, and I appreciate that you always ask probing questions. That's one of the things I like about your show. But that question, why did they do it? That's not something that anyone actually has an answer to, even in academia, and that's what makes it so perplexing. And that's why there's various theories of this. I'm thinking of maybe doing an article that kind of goes into the Mulroney era, which is past what we covered in the film. But if you look at that, there's a ton of articles on JSTOR talking about Mulroney's levels of immigration. And this was a conservative prime minister who increased our levels of immigration from roughly 100 to 150,000 all the way to 250,000 when he took office in 84. But by 89 or 90, Canada had started experiencing a minor recession. And the justification that Mulroney gave is, well, we need to build our workforce. That's what he did in 84 when he put the number up to 250. But in 1990, he did not reduce the number. Despite the fact that, we have unemployment, we don't have any jobs to give people, we're still bringing in people in record numbers. And if you go on JSTOR and you look at all these articles written around that time saying, well, why did he do that? Everyone's got a different answer. People can say, well, it's still good to maintain the policy. You don't want to back off because that'll discourage immigration in the future. Or, well, the people that he was bringing in were primarily business owners, and that's going to stimulate the economy. Or other people will say, much like we've done in this documentary, well, it's a bureaucratic incentive that's based on something that a prime minister said or a personal ideological thing that someone's obsessed with. And no one can agree with that. And I've got like 20 articles saved where it's like, a response to this guy, a counter response to this guy. And then this other academic jumps in and says, oh, no, you guys are all wrong. It's a completely different thing. So it's something that no one has been able to answer. And so we'd like to try to shed light on it. And but I'm not going to say that we totally, revealed everything about the working secrets of the Canadian government.
Yeah, I will just say the title of it's Paving Over the Public, in case we haven't mentioned that yet. It doesn't give any prescriptions for the future or a plan of action. It really is just to tell people what happened and tell a story that I just don't think has really been told before.
Yeah. Well, you said that once something happens for 10 years, then it just becomes a part of the institutional inertia. It just keeps on going because it's been going. But what about the effects of that? Well, also, if something's been going on for 10 years and it sucks, why not change it? Or does it suck?
Well, what's funny is that from a personal point of view, if you're engaged in a discussion with someone, if you are not pro something, they will say you're anti that thing. And they haven't mastered the nuance of saying, I just don't want to do it anymore. So like if you were to criticize immigration, so you're anti-immigration, which means you're anti-immigrant, which means you're anti these people. And a lot of regular, reasonable people, the people who might listen to my show might be a bit more tilted towards one direction. But your average American or average Canadian, they don't want to enter into an identity war in every conversation. So they'll say, oh, you're anti-immigrant. No, of course I'm not anti-immigrant. Oh, so you must be in favor of immigration. Then they'd get trapped in that. So just on a one-to-one basis, people just don't have the rhetorical ability to argue with it. But if something does suck, really the argument is in favor of the status quo. Because people will say they like change, but they don't really like change. But if you can, like I said, white knuckle some policy for long enough, you say, well, do you really want to change it? Because if you change it now, you are taking responsibility for any negative effects of that change. And no one wants to be responsible for that. Like maybe, immigration isn't so, I don't want to disrupt the entire system. And if people just don't have the research capabilities or the knowledge of how everything fits together, they might just be spooked by the prospect of, and there's all kinds of things you could, like for example, universal health care in Canada. That's a big topic. Or even like abortion in the US, anything like that, where it's like everyone kind of hates it. Everyone knows it's bad, but no one has a roadmap for how to take that away, because in the back of their heads, they're just imagining civilizational collapse. Like every change to the status quo is revolutionary in its intent. So it's always safer to just adhere to the status quo. At least that's what I think most people do, even if they don't like it.
I mean, even upstart political parties have experienced that. Like, think about Reform in the 1993 election, right? Like the Reform Party, which came out of the West and eventually did supplant the Conservatives, I think in 1997 as the official opposition. They were like a grassroots, like, Bible fundamentalist, some people would say conservative party, and they campaigned on reducing immigration to 100,000, but they then had to back out on that because every other party and every institution and the media totally just piled on them for that, right? And I think that, I think you might have already mentioned, Dimes, when you grow up as a kid, like I'm also in my 30s, the multiculturalism thing is beaten into you. And it's funny because they're saying this has always been the case, but really the multiculturalism policy, which was put into place on October 8th of 1971 by Pierre Trudeau, was something that, as far as I can tell, actually just came out of his own mind. Because if you look at the Bicultural Commission that began under Pearson and then concluded under Trudeau, that commission found that Canada was primarily not just a bilingual, but a bicultural nation, Anglophone and Francophone. But when he announced the policy, Trudeau said, oh, as per the fourth volume of the Bicultural Commission's report, we are a multicultural nation. But as Michael Temelini wrote in a book, 1968, A Year in Canada and Its Legacies, it doesn't say that anywhere in the fourth volume or anywhere else. So it seems to be that Trudeau had just said, well, I'm the architect of modern Canada. I'm going to do the Just Society thing. I've already started putting into place my own policies. We're called multicultural nation now. And then, like you said, that's the law of the land. And then everyone starts getting it beaten into them. So
absolutely. And when you're growing up within this paradigm, if you want to be against multiculturalism, you'll say, well, then what are you? Because the entirety of the Canadian identity currently is multiculturalism. And it's even worse for young people coming up now. And if you don't like that, well, then what? Now, that's something many Canadian nationalists are trying to answer right now. Like, what is there aside from just being a bit more British? That's the real question. And I think there's some great work being done in that. But now at this current juncture, it's almost impossible for young people to even imagine a Canadian identity outside of multiculturalism. And to the point, I remember when I was younger, we had a prime minister named Stephen Harper, and he had committed what was regarded at the time as an egregious gaffe, where he had just kind of gestured toward, in a speech, said, oh, old stock Canadians. Which was just saying, like, oh, there's such a thing as a Canadian who can trace his lineage back fucking 15, 20 generations, whatever it might be. And then they really pounce on him for that. So, well, what do you mean? What do you mean old stock? And he's just said, like someone who's been here for 3 generations, right? But it completely erasing the possibility that maybe someone can trace, like myself and perhaps Jean here, like your family has real fucking roots here. So you're just removing those people from the conversation, or saying that someone who's like 1 generation removed from getting here is just as Canadian as anyone else. So to counter that in any way, like you're really going up against the system. And I would say, like, I sympathize with normal people who are not a member of podcast race like myself, who just want to go about their lives. And understanding that
Yeah.
if they touch that third rail is such a huge rail that you can touch in Canada.
Yeah. But what ties Canada together other than the Canadian dollar and two languages? And every once in a while, you'll see a picture of a king or a queen hanging in a cafe.
Well, like I'll
I
speak to
think
my. Oh, sorry, you go, John.
no, go ahead. That's okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say just what I mentioned before was sort of this opposition to America. That's not
We're
even
not
much of the case.
America.
Yeah, that's a big for a lot of people. That's a big one. Other than that, there is sort of there's echoes of Canadianism, especially with European old stock Canadians, where you sense that you're a very outdoorsy people. You know, I try not to define ourselves commercially or in terms of consumption. People say, "Oh, Tim Hortons."
Yeah.
Terrible place.
Molson.
Oh, yeah, Molson and stuff like that. And I'm like, but aside from that, there's not a lot. And the thing is, if you try and grasp at that, you're seen as extreme. But for the regular people, what makes you Canadian, they will say tolerance. If you ask a liberal right now, they'll say tolerance. That's what makes us, we are the most tolerant, which makes us Canadian. And we love living within this rich tapestry of the rest of the world until the rest of the world gets too much. And then they say, no, something's, I liked it before, but I don't like it now. Like it's almost like it lives in their lizard brain. They know there's something there, but they've never said it before, which is interesting. But aside from that, as a nation, federally, there's actually not a lot keeping it together. Economically, not really. Identity-wise, not much. There's a lot of intra-provincial hostility going on. But John, what do you think about that?
Well, let me just back it down to one simple point. Let's look at the life, liberty, and happiness, which is the mantra of the United States, I think, still, versus peace, order, and good government, which was the fundamental way that Canadians describe themselves, right? We would rather see a robust state and a federalism that resisted not only American hegemony, but the multinational corporations that came out of America. Right? Like we built the railroad, or not we, but our first prime minister, John A. Macdonald, he built the railroad fundamentally to connect Canada so that we could have autarky, in the economic sphere. And when it comes to the state, it's funny because so the red Toryism thing that we touched upon earlier, that was a term that was, I believe, coined by Gad Horowitz, who was a Canadian historian in the 1960s, and he was describing the philosophy of a gentleman named George Grant, who I again referred to earlier, as a type of Anglo-conservatism that was something that took the welfare of the people into account and saw the state as an instrument towards preserving the welfare of the people as a whole, as opposed to something that was going to beat them over the head and, tax them, for example, right? Like we pay higher taxes, we get free healthcare. Healthcare system is broken, sure. But that's the fundamental Canadian attitude, right? Like we look at you guys, at least even, and again, I'm in the West, right? So we're like the most pro-capitalist, like we love oil, we love grain, I love canola, guys. And even here, there is some skepticism increasingly as people become like subsumed by American conservatism. But even here, fundamentally, I don't hear anyone say, let's get rid of healthcare. I mean, a couple of guys who are viewed as kooky would say that. But we're like, okay, we'll pay higher taxes, we get free healthcare. We look at the American system, and it's like everyone here has watched Sicko by Michael Moore a million times in their head. It's like the Canadian consciousness produced that film before it was even made. Because we're like, how could you pay for healthcare? You're going to throw people on the street because they have cancer, right? And I don't know how true that is or isn't, because I don't live in America, but that's something that I'm, preoccupied in my head. That's like a fundamental thing for me. Oh, we have to have free healthcare. You have to have public healthcare. Now, when you walk into a doctor's office, and again, I'm not trying to use hostile language, but I walked into a doctor's office. My wife and I had to go to an appointment a couple weeks ago, and everyone was, the certain, they looked like they weren't speaking English, and they didn't have the same skin color as I presume Dimes has. And so people point to that and they say, see, this is why it's broken, the immigration and all that's correct. But it's almost like it's the same thing. And I'm sorry to meander, but it's the same thing as the CBC. Like we hear a lot about the CBC, right? And how it's a state-run broadcaster. It's just like the Chinese Communist Party, it's the government propaganda or whatever. But the CBC was put into place by a conservative government of R.B. Bennett specifically to counter American takeover of Canadian media. And so a lot of conservatives, blue Tories will say we have to dismantle the CBC because it's state propaganda. But a lot of nationalists are saying you have to reform the CBC, but it's there for a purpose. We shouldn't take it away.
Yeah,
I agree completely. And like, just to circle back to this guy, Pierre Poilievre, conservative leader, him running on a small government or state reductivist platform, I'm like, that will never fly for the exact reason you're saying. Like, I don't think most Canadians even want a whittling down of the state in a bipartisan sense. And the example you gave, the CBC, we can give a wealth of other examples of government funding the arts. And I know my co-host Judas, he's against this because he's very much an ANCAP sort of guy. He's like, just burn it all down. Burn it all down. We don't need it. But I have very fond memories growing up of the Canadian music scene being funded by the government, and there's some great bands that come out of Canada.
Yeah, Bare Naked Ladies, the guy with the Superman song.
But we could go on for the rest of this with Canadian bands like Matthew Good, Tragically Hip, all kinds of
Strange Brew.
Yeah, but movies not so much. But but the idea is that I am not necessarily against these, one might call them statist reactions, and that's kind of that's a trap a lot of people fall into, where it's like, I don't like this version of the thing, then I'm anti that thing. And I think so. The Conservatives are just anti-government, but I don't even think they are. It's just this rhetoric they use.
Yeah. Well, it's the issue is that I had Geo on. You guys know Giant Geo. He's kind of
I know him very well.
Artist guy. Yeah, he's a great guy. And he gave me insight into the Canadian psychology as opposed to the Western or the American psychology, because we were the Americans were pioneers. We fled from society to found our own nation, and we kind of did a manifest destiny thing out from the east to the west. And whereas in Canada it was much more difficult to survive. So there was more of a need for the Mounties and for, the state kind of supporting the frontiersmen. And so in the generations as they unfolded, there was more of a relationship and more of a need for a relationship to a centralized government, because you guys are more further north and it was just more difficult to survive up there. So it makes sense that a people would want a state if that's in their mimetic blood, to want a state and to want the state to support them and work for them. But once that state says we are no longer a state, we are for the whole world, like that state no longer serves the people at all. The state now serves the entire world, or whoever the elite are that choose who the state serves. So without some sort of revolutionary fervor from the ground up saying, no, the government is for us and we are a people defined by whatever you're going to define it by, the government's going to keep on. You can't have a government that you want that's not serving you anymore. That's the major tension that I'm seeing.
I agree completely. And that's sort of the momentum we have going in Canada presently. I think it might have been kicked off a bit by the trucker convoy, but there's people like we might have, like you had said, the Canadian government defining itself as the apex of Fukuyama's end of history. We're going to be the most liberal, but we're confronted by the sheer economics of that endeavor and how it hasn't resulted in anything. And even like, it's kind of shocking. You'll see even Mark Miller, our Minister of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship, to see him say, "Oh, I think we overdid it on the immigration. We need to reel it in." Like it's pretty wild that even the staunchest adherents are saying that we might have gone.
How did they go overboard? And is it public opinion? Is it because it's destroying the country? Like why would he state that?
The discourse in Canada right now is so powerfully against Indians from India that I think it was unignorable. And the fact that you have a mass migration crisis. So, and any crisis has many different vectors that are responsible for it. So on one hand, you have too many Indians coming over on student visas, and they're coming in with falsified documents. That's a problem. B, because the system isn't set up to absorb that many. Same thing happened with Chinese migration. B, they're cheating their way through academia. That's a problem. C, there's not enough jobs for them when they get out, and they all want to stay. They don't want to. They're using the student visa program as just a backdoor for Canadian citizenship, and there just isn't enough anything for that. And then D, that the Canadians are agitating that this is bad in a way that they've never really done that before.
Really?
At such a scale that I don't think it's ignorable. So I
even
think
like
that,
liberals or the common liberal doesn't mind expressing discontent with the state of the this
and
people, this other coming over in such
and they
large
will
numbers.
point to Indians, but not mass migration generally. That's the thing. They'll say, okay, we went wrong in this one area with this one initiative. However, we are not anti-migration or immigrant generally. However, I think that's beginning to change because there's also a problem on the West Coast. And we talked about this pretty extensively on our show with Chinese migration in BC and the funneling in not only of Chinese Communist Party agents, but also the triads. Basically, Canada, and this is a problem America's dealing with and has been dealing with for a couple of decades now, that Canada is the number one pipeline of fentanyl into North America, created in Chinese factories, the Chinese Communist Party working hand in glove with the triads, and then bringing in all this fentanyl. Most of it just comes right in through those ports. And there's a phenomenal book. Sam Cooper writes about this, and there's another book titled Willful Blindness. The author's name escapes me right now, but they talk about it's sort of like this narco war that China is waging on North America. A lot of people don't like to talk about that because they think that anything anti-China, it's like, oh, you're just falling for propaganda. But no, that's an issue that does not seem relevant to the American discourse, but it's very, very relevant to the Canadian discourse, and that there's a real problem with Chinese agents getting elected to office, and then it's a real estate problem. Now, anyway, that's a whole mess, but yeah.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of different messes. There's a lot of different fires up there.
So people will talk about the Indian thing, but not the China thing. And that's not even trying to say like, oh, fuck all Chinese people or anything, but it's like, this is a real thing, but I guess we're not ready for that just yet.
It's always amazed me that when Trudeau was running for the first time, I believe, he was in front of a bunch of women in a cafe who were ogling him because of his, he just exudes some sort of
Because I've never seen hair before.
Power. Really?
Yeah, they've never seen a guy with a nice head of fucking... Trudeau looks weird. If you see Trudeau smile, it sucks. I hate his face. But sorry, continue.
Well, but he said openly that he admires the Chinese government because they can get things done on a dime, right? He admires tyranny. He just said that openly. That's so weird as an American to hear that. Like, you want somebody who admires China of all places. So it was really odd to me how far that particular politician went with balking at least American values. So maybe they're more in line with Canadian values, like a centralized government and like more efficacy with regard to top-down orders and authoritarianism for the good of the people, supposedly.
Absolutely. And that's the dream of every bureaucrat as well. So that's like every
it's their
lawyer
dream, but to hear them say that out loud is rather offensive to my ears.
Yeah, I don't know if that many Canadians are average. What do you think about that statement?
Oh, sorry, me?
Oh, yeah. What do you think with the statement?
I mean, I don't know. I thought it was kind of funny. I didn't put too much stock in it. Yeah.
It reminds me of and this is connected to the short documentary. There's this great book by Richard Werner titled Princes of the Yen. I don't know if you've ever read that one. I would recommend everyone reads it. It's the story of Japan during the same time period of what we're talking about right now and the post-war years after World War II and how Japan was rebuilt. And it's similar to the story of what happened in Canada because right after World War II, there's this idea that, well, Japan liberalized. It liberalized in every single dimension and became, more free and democratic. And that is a total lie. If anything, it became more fascist. They wouldn't call themselves fascist, but it was their economic recovery, which is one of the great comeback stories in global economics, was driven mostly by central planning, but central planning working in tandem with these manufacturing cartels, many of which persist to this day. People always talk about how you can convert a manufacturing economy to a war economy. like America did. Well, Japan did the same thing, but they converted a manufacturing economy to a war economy, and then that war economy to a manufacturing war economy. So they just said, we're going to keep waging war, but we're going to wage economic war. And we're going to do it South Korea kind of like Asian politics is a lot like this, where there's most of it's behind the scenes with, it's very dynastic, it's very feudal in that sense. But there was a point in the 90s, after they had really rebuilt themselves internally and created this whole new system, that they wanted to enter the international stage, that they wanted their trade to go global. And they didn't control that conversation because America did. The West did. America more. So they said, well, look, you actually can't wage economic war. We'll just sanction you. We'll just add tariffs. Now, if you want to participate in global trade, now you're actually going to need to liberalize. And this was happening the entire time. They knew what was going on. They just didn't care because Japan was a convenient ally to pressure China. So they said, do whatever you need to do to get back to be our friend in the region and actually be able to project power. But then they said, well, you're going to need what Canada did by appealing to the UN. It's like, oh, you want to enter the international stage? Well, you actually need to liberalize. And during the 90s, there was this whole shift that happened in Japan when they started breaking up these cartels. That's a whole other story entirely. But just to show that the same sort of phenomena was happening in a lot of nations around the world.
Yeah. Are there kind of cartels in Canada? How are the major vectors of industry and GDP generation controlled or managed?
I can name one. I don't know if you can name it, John, but the one that springs to mind when you hear cartel, because we call it that here, is the dairy cartel in Canada. So all the dairy producers, and again, I'm not even necessarily anti-cartel. I know some listeners might be against that. Cartels aren't just for cocaine. They're for other stuff too. But there's the cartels we acknowledge. Then there's other manufacturing cartels that even my co-host Judas could speak to because he works in manufacturing. But there's sort of clandestine unity of manufacturers trying to figure out how to incorporate international forces. And that's the bad sort of thing. But with the dairy cartel, it's just protectionist for Ontario dairy producers, and everyone complains about it because the milk sucks and we can't get good butter. I went to France's Paris, just a couple months ago, and it turns out I had not been eating butter my entire life.
Oh,
I tried the butter in Paris, and it actually tastes good. It tastes like delicious, rich, satiny, creamy butter, like how it fucking should. And then I come back here, and it's like, I don't know, I just been eating fucking ivermectin the entire. Oh shit, I'm not supposed to.
No. No, you can eat it, just not for certain things.
It's just, but also like that's part and parcel of what we're talking about before. It's like, well, are you anti-Canadian dairy farmers getting together to hold back American incursion into the marketplace? Not necessarily.
America.
Well, that's the thing. So, but it's a very passionate topic in Canada.
One reason why I bring up the business interests or the cartels specifically is that not another vector of power to leverage to stymie mass immigration? Are there other power players other than the government that could be shifted or could find it within their interests to be more pro-Canada and less pro-international?
I mean, I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking, and maybe it's an aside, but when it comes to the elites in Canada, there's what's known as the Laurentian elite, which is like the entrenched elite on the East Coast, and that's all your bureaucrats and your politicians and your old money. And then on the West, there's what's called, I don't know what it's called colloquially, but I refer to it as like the Western elite. So that's the guys who like are the oil money executives, the guys who are involved in like resource extraction and that kind of thing. And there's always been a setup where there's a dichotomy between the two, and they're going to be eternally opposed, which is part of that is what I referred to earlier with the ascendancy of reform in the 90s, which was was like a upstart political party. That
sounds like the Western elite would be more readily happy with getting along with America. Like
that's true. Leaning. That's true. I think that's true. The point that I was making with regards to immigration, though, is people who have championed the Western elite in the past as maybe a vector that could kind of take on the Laurentian elite, take over the government, are now coming to terms, I think, increasingly, and I think Dimes maybe knows more about this because he just knows more people than I do. I think they're increasingly saying, oh wait, the Western business elites who are eternally opposed to the Laurentian elite also want mass immigration because it's good for business. So I don't know.
That's the problem. Even when we talk about cartels, like we assume that these homegrown cartels would be nativist, right? But that's not even the case a lot of the time. Like they can be like a lot of unions, like they're looking out for the union. They don't give a shit about the larger social organism. So don't take for granted that just because they're an elite that they would try and be more nationalistic. It could be quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm. I mean, our unions were taken over in the 40s and 50s by communists, particularly, and I say this, and I promise you I'm not being the conspiracy theorist, but primarily of Jewish extraction. So like the Canadian Jewish Congress, the Jewish Committee on Labor, operatives like Kalman Kaplansky or Sal Bronfman. These were guys who basically, I mean, they had been discriminated against. Jews were absolutely discriminated against, as they were in most countries in the 30s and 40s, right? And they took over the labor unions because it was the only thing they really had access to at that time in terms of vectors of power. And they actively tried to reject nativist concerns and turn people to more of a pluralistic way of thinking, presumably because then they could create a spot for themselves. And they did that knowing that anti-Semitism was rampant at the time in those unions. And so they often had progressives who were of Anglo extraction kind of be the face of those kind of things. And that's well detailed in a book that Canadians would be well to read, which is called Repression and Resistance by Ross Lambertson. And just very quickly, all the books that I'm giving people, again, they're not schizo books. These are like books published in Toronto University, McGill, Queens. Like these are university press. These are academic books that I'm talking about.
Yeah, the funny thing is half the time these are books written by the perpetrators of whatever it is we're describing, and they're just saying, yeah, this is what we did. And isn't that cool? Just to speak to the communist infiltration, we covered this on my show, Blood Satellite. We did a stream where, I don't know if people know this, but the Canadian Communist Party made a documentary about themselves. It doesn't have a lot of views, but you can go look that up, the Canadian Communist Party, and they basically take credit for all this stuff. And that's always one. Some see it as a more heterodox idea, but there's this misconception that Marxist, leftist, but Marxist specifically, pioneered labor unions. And I always push back against that. Labor unions, and which is really just kind of like a guild, really emerges from a guild conceptualization. They predate Marxism in almost every single instance I can think of, pull from history books. The union started first, and then the Marxists came in and just corrupted it. But they've never created any movement themselves like that. And so workers' rights, labor rights kind of became this reeking thing where maybe it didn't need to be. And the story of Canada is the exact thing I'm describing.
Yeah. Well, can you model that infiltration and corruption and just turn it into something the opposite of corruption? Can you take over these institutions? Is there any room for alternative institutions, or is political power within the Canadian context restrained to restaffing or persuading existent institutions to, love their people more than everybody else?
I say yes. A lot of people disagree or think I'm too naive because on our side of the fence, in our political milieu, there's hostility to anyone proposing a long march through the institutions, which is what was done before. Like, oh, yes, we could re-infiltrate. Yes, we could turn the system around in our favor. Maybe that's a multi-generational task. We don't have that time.
No, you don't.
As a result, I don't think most people just want to do it because it sounds boring or it sounds like a waste of time, or they are black-pilled. And I hear the arguments for that, and I get it. But it would be possible, in my opinion, but it would involve a lot of people doing relatively boring stuff that they don't want to do. Yeah. And, I just, for one reason or another, whether valid or invalid, there's just no patience or appetite for that.
Well, what would they be fighting for? Some notion of Canada that doesn't seem to hold real water. I don't. Is there a patriotism? Is there like a really deep love of Canada as such by Canadians?
What do you think, Jean? This is a big question. I have an answer, but I'm wondering what you think about that.
I mean, I think a lot of guys are trying to. So again, this is a big question. I think biculturalism is something that a lot of guys are going back to. Like Fortis talks about that a lot. and the cultures that are represented on the red ensign. So I think the notion of biculturalism, and then also the positive as opposed to the a negative, like anti-American aspects that are embodied in red Toryism, that is like a strong state, a social good, within a bicultural context, is something that people are maybe pursuing. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean the demographic here. I mean, what does Fortasek? Okay, I don't want to misquote Fortasek because I don't know him that well, but he's always talking about how the fact that we still have notions of the Anglo and the Franco spheres in Canada can actually help us versus the American melting pot thing. So I think that a lot of people who are ethnically inclined would kind of go that route. But then it begs the question. It's like, well, if someone's Ukrainian or Russian, I mean, they're not Anglo, are they? Or they're
Yeah.
not
Well, consider
Francophone
this.
anymore.
Would these people see themselves as a Canadian more than a white person? Just
Mhm.
based on how you stack your identities, right? I think you would have more racial solidarity in America, in Canada rather, than Canadian patriotism. Now, an interesting, and when people, maybe if they watch this later, this might not be in the headlines, but everyone listening now will recall that like a week ago, we're talking about Canadian annexation, or Trump was flirting with the idea. We mentioned that at the top of the episode.
Yeah.
Now, what was the reaction to that? It's very interesting. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of people who were up in arms about that. Even our politicians are like, "How dare you? Don't threaten our sovereignty." The things you're supposed to say, and then everyone mentions the exact same thing, which is, "We're going to go down to your White House and burn it down like we did before." It's like,
Yeah.
okay, that just it sounds like a meme. It does sound like an empty threat, but now, is that due to Canadian patriotism, or do you just not like a bully? And I think that's a important demarcation there between two types of people. Like, do you just hate bullies? Do you hate do you feel like you're just bloviating and standing up to like Trump? Or is your Canadian identity something you're willing to go burn down the White House for or die for? And I guess that's the question that we're trying to ask on our side, which is that, do you have an identity you would be willing to suffer and die for versus an international order that you think you're on the right side of history for endorsing? Now, I would say most Canadians are the latter rather than the former. And a good question is, and I always would put this to a lot of my liberal friends, like, let's say China, Russia, America invaded tomorrow. What percentage of the Canadian population would take up arms to defend it? And I mean really like guerrilla warfare. I bet first of all, most immigrants would just go home because they know where home is. Are they willing to die for this country? Not all of them. Like a lot of immigrants would. I bet they would, but not most, right? So like, and that's a thought experiment. You don't need to have the answer right now, but really try and dig into that. How many Canadians would actually die for Canada, the state, versus their identity as an Anglo or Quebecois, and even if not that, then a white person, a French person, whatever it might be. These are complicated questions that are perhaps a bit more streamlined in the American context, but here, I really get the sense that something is happening up in Canada. There is a vibe of becoming. There's conversations being had up here. There's opportunities up here for something like an ethnogenesis, for something like building. If we are indeed a post-nation state, and that is the status quo, can you form a nation inside that? Well, we know that nations are allowed to exist within Canada. For example, the Aboriginal nations, each Aboriginal band tribe is technically its own nation with its own laws, and our police can't go in there. Then you have Quebec, which has its own. If you don't speak French, they can expel you and fine you. They can do. There's all kinds of legal structures in there to create the boundaries of a distinct people. So you can do that here, maybe even easier than in America. There is that in America for sure. Ask any Texan. But yeah.
Yeah, on a mythological level. Speaking of ethnogenesis, the Red Tory as an idea doesn't really work because the Red Tory would have some sort of loyalty to the crown, and the crown is basically just a shadow over the vassal state that Great Britain has become to America, right? So Great Britain just affects America's will. So far as I understand it, they don't even have their own antibodies to resist the mass immigration right now. So who would Canada be loyal to? Like on a
Well,
go on.
I'm super sorry for interrupting.
No,
I've done
no,
that
not
several
at all.
times. I'm chomping at the bit here. So this is again, this is another aside. I think Canadians, we like to do this. We like to just jump around and not answer the question. But this is what springs to mind when you ask the question. So are you Catholic? I think you're Catholic, right?
Me?
Or am I mistaken? Yeah.
No, I'm not.
Oh, you're not. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sympathetic to certain aspects of the Catholic experience. I'll say that.
I see. Okay. So I'm Orthodox, and in Orthodoxy, we have the notion of an autocephalous church. So, for example, I go to an OCA, so Orthodox Church of America parish, and they're ultimately descended from the Russian tradition, but they're an autocephalous church. So we have all of the same traditions. We're our own institution, but everything that we do is descended from the Russian tradition. So perhaps that's the same kind of thing. So we are doing the Russian practice, but we're doing our own thing. Do you know what I mean? So perhaps Canada can be it can encompass the same thing, being that the empire has fallen. We have the same traditions. It doesn't mean that that we have to fall too.
What traditions would be?
Well, just in the Red Toryism, you said that the Red Toryism necessitates that the English crown is still ascendant, and I'm saying that's not necessarily the case. If you can do it with a theological institution, then why not a political?
But I mean, what binds other than Tim Hortons, Molson Ice, and there's a cigarette brand. I don't even know if you guys are allowed to smoke anymore, actually. So I'll stay away from the cigarettes. But like, what rituals? What other than language? What is there that really binds Canada as a people?
Again, I don't mean to repeat myself because I guess maybe I'm not answering.
I guess I'm repeating myself. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, I think we both are. So maybe we're coming to a head here. Maybe the end of it. But again, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as juxtaposed by peace, order, and good government, and the conception of what it is to be a Canadian. And I think that Arthur Lower, who I referred to earlier, talked about an ethnogenesis that took place in Canada. In the uncivilized period where the English and the Francophones were trying to do something. And as Dimes talked about, maybe there is a new ethnogenesis that could come about, probably linked to white Canadians. I hate to, I'm not necessarily saying I'm an ethno-nationalist, but that probably makes more sense because I think white Canadians have a lot in common with each other. I think that, here's what I mean. You can talk about hockey and Tim Hortons and this, that, and the other thing. There are people that I know who are Canadian and would see themselves as Canadian. They might be second or third generation descended from a South Asian population or an East Asian population or an African population. And they talk like me and they're like, oh, hey, how's it going, buddy? But they're still linked for the most part with their mother culture. And that's the thing about Canadians, because we're multicultural, we're hyphenated. And so we've never been mixed into that melting pot. And most people from the third world, especially because they've been stirred out by anti-white DEI woke stuff, whatever term we want to use, they don't really see that they're Canadian in a sense. And they usually connect being a Canadian with being white. And I think that white Canadians do the same thing, although perhaps unknowingly. So I think that the people who have actually given up the hyphenization are probably white Canadians generally, whereas everyone else in the multicultural context, probably because of their heritage or whatever, but also because it's a good thing to be, to say, hey, I'm black or I'm brown, you got to hire me or whatever. They still do that, and they're unable to give that up. I mean, we have laws like, for example, we have the Employment Equity Act of 1984, which says that in any federally regulated industry, there has to be a certain percentage of women, non-whites, aboriginals, and people with disabilities. So, I mean, why would you give that up? Why would you give up your hyphenized identity, right? So that almost precludes people from the melting pot that is being a Canadian, which is not supposed to be a melting pot. And then, I don't know, Dimes, do you kind of see what I'm picking up here? Or?
It's a very big question. And there's an answer, then there's a plan on what to do from there. Because what I think Benjamin is correctly identifying is there doesn't seem to be a lot of ligature, a lot of connective tissue between these things. So to me, the answer is something like, okay, we look at Canada. The main defining characteristic of Canada is sort of the Anglo-Franco binary. And I think if you were to start a conversation about what that is, I don't think it's a fusion of those two. It's almost like a constant dialectical tension between those two forever. So that's a big part of Canadian identity. And that constitutes the center of power that everyone is sort of magnetized towards. And when we talk about how to create a new type of people, I think what we're also saying is it's not a blank canvas and whole cloth, and something that John said, which is that we'll never lose the Britishness. like you walk around Ontario and every second street is loyalist this or loyalist that. Like that is a part of it. You can't surgically remove that. So we're always going to be carrying that forward, and the francophones are always going to be carrying forward some kind of sort of francophone nature, some kind of French culture. Having said that, one aspect that's undeniable about Canada is like you are of this nation if you don't have a homeland. Not really. Now, and I think that's why we must sever the connection to Britain. Now, you can keep the iconography, you can keep that spirit, because you cannot excise that spirit. However, when I hear, Red Ensign people say it's for God, Queen, and country, that rings hollow to me. And I think it rings hollow to everyone else. It's just a fucking catchphrase. And so I return to what I had said before, which is, what would you suffer and die for about your identity? Now, I think some people would do that along racial lines because they sense an absence of a sort of distinct ethnic, and that's what's so interesting. But so many Canadians will see themselves as white, but they won't see themselves as Anglophone Ontarians or something. Because it's my argument that the racial identity emerges from a distinct ethnic identity, and for some reason we're lacking that now. There's this great book that I read on the show quite a while ago called The Gates of Europe. And I'm not trying to get into a Russia and Ukraine thing, but it actually tracked the history of Ukrainian nationalism. Why is there a push? And there is a push. There is a self-determination. There is a strive for sovereignty within the Ukrainian nation. And I'm not trying to get into a geopolitical argument, but why are they not just Russian? Why are they fighting for their independence? It's not just a concoction of NATO that they're doing this. There's actually a long history. And what you notice if you look at the history of that Ukrainian nationalism movement, there is sort of a nucleus of an intellectual movement. That one thing you get in Canada is there's a lot of patriots. There's a lot of people who are willing to fight against America, but there actually is a very limited intellectual backing for the identity. Now, because we're living in the 21st century, most people on our side, in our political milieu, they hate intellectualism. Too much theory, too much talking. We don't want to do that at all. And I would say, yes, within the American context or the European context, maybe, but I think to attain the level that these other examples have, there does need to be a robust intellectual movement, and it's maybe not everyone needs to participate in it, but there has to be something there to answer your question, which is what's the elevator pitch for Canadian identity? The answer to the question is there isn't one. We have these component parts. And I think that's the project we're engaged in now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what about just what's in front of you with replacement of the white population? That's just what we're talking about right now. So I don't mean to get racialist or anything like that, but no. Replacement of the white population by foreigners or others.
It depends on the number, because I've seen numbers as high as, and it depends what you count as an immigrant. Well, they'll say like, oh, if you look at the numbers, 70% of Canada is now immigrant based. You say that, it's like, what the fuck? Everyone's Pakistani now. It's like, well, no, they're kind of counting Italian immigrants too. Like it all depends on the details of how you're counting that. However, the trends in Canada are very similar, if not worse, than anything you would hear in America. They're pretty open about. They're openly saying like, basically, white people are dying, and we need new people to form a tax base, to form a serfdom. They won't call it that, but that's what it is. To just prop up. Don't you want to live like boomers? Here's how you live like boomers. We need infinity Indians to give us money so now you can retire. Don't you want to retire, Zoomer? Because most Zoomers and millennials, they've already resigned themselves to never being able to retire. Our future looks like the Great Depression. We're just going to be working on a farm until we die. But they're just saying, oh, but you need a tax base for that. That's what it looks like here. It's as bad as anywhere else. And just at the point in the video that we had produced, which is interesting, is that this argument is new. It went without saying. Every population boom throughout history was just through rising birth rates.
Yeah.
And only now, only within our historical time period does that sound alien. But if you go back to the 30s, it's like, well, how do you have more babies? Well, you have more babies. And that's what the fucking baby boom was. And, I understand declining birth rates. That is a reality. However, there's 100 things you could do to address that before bringing in illiterate 20-year-olds en masse,
Yeah. Well, what about that then, that vector of birth rates? Doesn't that's a huge cultural ask, especially for the modern liberal female.
You're ending on the biggest questions of all, like, because like I said, it's multitudinous. So why are people having fewer kids? Well, it's not even obvious that it's a financial problem. People will cite that, saying it's not. We don't have enough money to have kids. That's more of a cope. And in experiments we've run in the past, if you just give people more money, it's not even obvious that they'll have more kids. In fact, the circumstances of the West, even immigrants who you would expect to have 20 kids, their birth rates decline over time as well. So and it's also impacting every country in the world. Birth rates are declining globally. So it's a strange phenomenon that just the size and shape of this problem is almost too big for most people to look at. Like, what is causing everyone in the fucking world to have less kids? Some people will say, oh, it's just liberalism. That seems like a glib answer. Sure, it's necessary but insufficient to the size of the problem. Then you're factoring environmental problems. You're in fact the women problem. Like, what do we do about a society that has had half a century of feminist hammers striking it? You know what I mean? Like, there is no easy solution to that. Some people have very, very extreme solutions to that. Like something akin to Sharia law, but even in the Muslim world, that's starting to shift as well. You know what I was reading? There's this great book called, was it Sex and Culture by James Unwin, published in like 1930. I think I got the name right. And it was studying the sexual mores and the laws of these tribes throughout the world, Africa, Papua New Guinea, South America and whatnot. And tribes that had no real they weren't used as American or British outposts or anything. They were it's anthropological studies. And he started noticing that even within these tribes, you started seeing something like a feminist revolution occur. And I'm trying to remember the exact example, but there was I think it was somewhere in Mexico. It was one of these tribes that they had a firm line between men and women, and the men never ate at the table of women. But there was this one sort of leader that they had, and it was a big deal that he went to eat at the table of women, and that was seen as the death of the ancien regime in that area. And that was not due to agitation from any NGO or any American missionary. It's just like a thing that happened, but it was sort of the penultimate thing that this had been, years and years in the making, that secretly, in people's homes, they actually became more egalitarian. What caused that? I actually don't know. It's some kind of emergent phenomena. And I think, and if there's an answer to it, it needs to be 7 answers at once. And it's not just like, oh, we need to make women illiterate and chained up. Like that's I mean, I'm saying that as a joke, but that's also what some people say.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of a lazy answer, but the return of something akin to family values, and by family values, I mean specifically not listening to death metal or rap, but that for young men, the highest goal is to have a family, and then to provide for a family, which will attract women who would want to live a life within that vision of the world.
And that's what we're doing right now in our space. I'm seeing that something, I can speak from my perspective as a millennial male, that one thing that we're doing that I didn't see evident in the boomers or even their forebears was men genuinely wanting to be fathers. And not just that, but raise their children, raise sons and daughters. Culturally, there was this paradigm where it's like, oh, men are supposed to hate their kids. They see them as bothersome impediments to their own pursuits. And there's some people who still think that, but I think having a present father is essential for raising them. And then you're thinking multi-generationally. Yeah. And that's a shift that's happening. And this might not bear fruit for a few generations, but I see more people in our space presently asking multi-generational questions. Knowing. And I gave a speech at an event in December. I was talking about this. Like, there's a generation, maybe 2 generations, Zoomers and Millennials and maybe even Gen X, but they understand that they're planting trees whose shade they will never enjoy, right? They're understanding that nothing was passed down to me, so I must enact the work to pass something on to my children. And you're going to suffer. It's going to suck. And it's not going to result in immediate boons for you. But you know what? Fuck it. That's the only thing that matters, and there's a nobility to that, I assume.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be for everyone. Like, this isn't a socialist project you can just get everyone to do. This is what I would describe as a genetic bottleneck. I don't think we're going through a total collapse right now. We are going through a genetic bottleneck where certain people will propagate. And not only will they propagate, because it's not just about baby maxing, they will propagate and raise their children to be whatever you want to call it, aristocratic. Let's just say that. But they will create families that don't just fall apart after one generation, because that's what you see. Take some of these families, give them $1 billion, they're done after 2 generations because they also didn't raise their kids or do it right.
Yeah.
That's a very long answer. I hope that.
No, this is fascinating stuff. It's very cutting edge. Your documentary is excellently produced.
Thank
do you guys
you so
have
much.
more in the works? And was that just one episode? I only watched one. Was there a second part to it that I missed?
That was the first one. I wanted to make it a series, and
good.
Jean is going to be integral to that, because this wouldn't have been able to happen without the team of people behind it. Jean was essential to that. Also, our videographer, he runs a company called Arbalest Editing. His name's Censored Anon. I work with him extensively producing videos for Blood Satellite. The music was produced by this amazing label called Noise Reich Records. The musician was named Nanoside. He produced this. He's kind of like an Aphex Twin character, if you know that, where he produces electronic music, but he's got an analog rig. He formulates this music so amazingly, and so this was a team effort. And what I would like to do is produce more of them, and that's why this was sort of a proof of concept to see if people like it. And the response has been phenomenal so far. So I'm very, very happy.
Well, I'm going to link all the links in the description, but where can people find the documentary and both of yours work? And what are they going to find when they get there?
The documentary can be found. It's a YouTube channel called Good Suffer Productions, and the Suffer has a V for the U. The title is Paving Over the Public, Canadian Immigration Policy in Opposition to Public Opinion. I also run a show titled Blood Satellite, a weekly show. And Good Suffer is sort of like a brand that we also sell merchandise from. There's the storefronts, but this is the first of what I hope will be many such video productions. And Jean, is there any place people could find you aside from our work together?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm just on Twitter X. The name on there is Jean Gracie, JeanGracie, and the @ is SH Handshake. That's all. I don't really post very often. I'm thinking of posting more, but yeah, that's where you can find me if you want to contact me.
What are you working on, Jean? Or generally speaking?
You know what? I used to under a different handle, I used to do a lot of things like I would just comment on the news and like link it to polling data and historical stuff. So I was thinking of maybe starting that up again, but it's been a few years since I did any of that. So that's but mostly I just want to work with Dimes on anything that he's got coming up and just
I'm keeping them all to myself. But we've been talking about this. We have a whole set of following documentaries and videos we would like to do. So I think there's going to be no shortage of things coming from us.
Wonderful. Well, I hope to have you guys back on as this story unfolds and as your work unfolds. And it's been a great time hanging out with you. I'm really happy to have met you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm great. Thank you again for having us on. I'm a fan, so this is just a great day for me.
Glad to hear it. I'm going to end the recording now. So signing off. Boom. Cool.